So while the United States is, building the AI that is fundamentally rewiring how the world works, and China is out there manufacturing the solar panels and the electric vehicles that are basically going to power the next century, do you know what the European Union is producing?
I'm guessing a rather large stack of paperwork.
Literally a 400-page dossier on how to regulate them. I mean, that is what they are producing right now.
Yeah, and it's a pretty striking contrast when you lay it out like that. Like, you have these two massive global engines operating on this philosophy of, rapid creation, aggressive deployment, just iterating on the fly. And then you have this third power, which historically was their equal, right?
Right.
But now they've become just hyper-focused almost exclusively on the legal and philosophical frameworks surrounding the things other people create.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because the data we are digging into today for this deep dive paints a picture that is fascinating, but honestly, it's also genuinely alarming if you live or work anywhere near these industries.
Oh, absolutely.
We're exploring this central, almost tragic premise that Europe, which, let's remember, is literally the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, appears to have essentially traded its industrial and technological competitiveness for bureaucracy.
Yeah, it's like they transitioned from being a global producer to just being a serial regulator.
Exactly, a serial regulator of other people's goods. And the mission for this deep dive is to impartially break down the mechanics of how this happened, and more importantly, where this whole trajectory is leading.
Right, and we're going to do that by sifting through a massive stack of recent economic reports, geopolitical analyses, and crucially, the highly anticipated Draghi report on European competitiveness.
Yeah, that Draghi report is wild. We'll get into that. But we're looking strictly at the data, the supply chains, the physical realities here.
Yeah.
No ideological sides, because the numbers themselves tell an undeniable story.
And, if you are listening to this right now, maybe driving to work or sitting at your desk, you might be thinking, European bureaucracy, that sounds incredibly dry. Why do I care?
Right, how does this affect my Tuesday?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it dictates your daily reality. This isn't just some abstract policy debated in a vacuum in Brussels. This regulatory framework dictates the technology you are literally allowed to use on your smartphone.
Yeah.
It dictates the price of your energy bill at the end of the month, the cost of the car you drive. I mean, it is actively reshaping the global job market.
It's the invisible architecture of the digital world. So if you want to understand why certain features aren't launching on your devices, or why inflation seems permanently sticky in certain sectors, you really have to understand this regulatory shift.
You have to understand the new rules of the game.
So let's start with the most modern battlefield we have, which I think perfectly illustrates this gap between creating the future and just writing the rules for it: technology, specifically the rollout of the AI Act.
Right. So the European Union's AI Act is arguably one of the most monumental and complex pieces of tech legislation ever drafted.
Without a doubt.
Europe aggressively positioned itself to be the first major global jurisdiction to heavily regulate artificial intelligence. The act has been rolling out in phases, but the severe sanctions, the massive fines, the strict transparency obligations, they are fully kicking in by the summer of 2026.
But here is the massive glaring irony I found in the sources. Europe is leading the world in AI regulation, but Europe has virtually no generative AI models of its own that can actually compete with the American giants.
None. There is no European equivalent to OpenAI or Google's DeepMind or Anthropic.
Right. They're writing this definitive, exhaustive rulebook for a game they aren't even playing.
Yeah, analysts often call this the sheriff without land paradox.
The sheriff without land. I love that.
Right. You've assumed the mantle of the ultimate regulatory authority, but you don't actually possess any of the underlying assets. You have a badge and a gun, but no town to protect. And the real-world impact of this is hitting the market right now.
Because of the complexity of the AI Act, U.S. tech giants like Apple and Meta are actively delaying the release of their most advanced AI features in the European market.
Exactly. They're just holding them back.
But wait, let me try to understand the mechanics here. Are companies like Apple just throwing a tantrum over the fines, or is the law actually, impossible to follow? Because these are trillion-dollar companies. Surely they can afford to pay a few lawyers to fill out the forms.
Well, it goes way deeper than just filling out forms or paying a fine. It's about the structural impossibility of some of the mandates. Take the transparency clauses, for example.
Okay.
Under the AI Act, if you deploy a powerful general-purpose AI, Regulators can demand incredibly granular transparency regarding your training data. They want to know exactly what copyrighted material might have been absorbed, how the algorithm weights certain concepts, how to uncouple specific data points.
But from what I understand about how large language models work, the training data is essentially the entire internet. It's trillions of parameters.
Trillions, yes.
It's not a neat Excel spreadsheet you can just hand over to a bureaucrat in Brussels and say, here's the data.
Exactly the problem. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of the technology by the lawmakers themselves. The models are neural networks. They learn patterns. They don't just store files in a searchable database.
Yeah, right.
So when a company like Apple looks at the European market, they realize they literally cannot untangle their proprietary model to satisfy the exact wording of the law. And the penalty for failing to do so isn't just a slap on the wrist.
No, it's brutal. It can be a massive percentage of their global revenue.
Global revenue, not just what they make in Europe.
Right, so the risk-reward calculation changes entirely for them.
Totally. The logical business decision is simply to say, the legal risk is too high, we will just skip Europe for this rollout, or release a severely downgraded compliant version.
So if I'm tracing the ripple effect here, the regulatory framework is essentially punishing its own citizens. It's depriving European consumers and, honestly, European businesses of future productivity tools, all to maintain this abstract standard of regulatory purity.
That is the exact macroeconomic consequence. Imagine you have two competing graphic design firms, right?
Yeah.
One in Chicago and one in Berlin.
Okay, Chicago and Berlin.
The firm in Chicago gets access to the latest generative AI tools. They can produce 50 concepts an hour. The firm in Berlin is legally barred from using that exact same tool, so they produce 5 concepts an hour using older software.
Wow.
When you deprive an entire continent's workforce of cutting-edge productivity tools, you just bake in a structural, unavoidable economic disadvantage.
And the people actually trying to build the future in Europe, they see the writing on the wall. I mean, the sources point out that looking ahead to 2026, only 18% of European tech founders feel that the EU regulatory environment actually favors innovation.
82% is an abysmal metric.
It's terrible.
If 82% of your own innovators, the people you are relying on to build your future tax base, think the rules are actively working against them, you have a systemic failure in your industrial policy.
That this sheriff without land thing, it isn't just happening in AI. It seems to be a pattern across the entire digital landscape. Like, we also have the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, the DSA and DMA.
Yeah, those are massive regulatory pillars targeting what Brussels calls the internet's gatekeepers. We're talking about the foundational platforms: Google, Apple, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft.
And I notice a pretty obvious trend there. Those are all American companies.
All American. Plus ByteDance, the Chinese parent company of TikTok. The DMA and DSA are designed to force these platforms to fundamentally alter their architecture, opening up closed ecosystems, changing how they handle third-party data, policing user content with much heavier hands.
But let me play devil's advocate for a second here. On the surface, if we ignore the nationality of the companies, isn't it a good thing to hold monopolies accountable? We constantly hear about the dangers of big tech having unchecked power over our data. Shouldn't someone step in and be the referee?
Well, regulating monopolies to ensure fair competition is absolutely a standard function of a healthy market.
Right.
The issue arises when we look at the actual economic ecosystem Europe has built. Europe isn't building alternatives to these platforms.
Oh, true.
There is no European search engine capturing global market share.
Yeah.
There's no European social network rivaling Meta. Therefore, the regulatory apparatus isn't fostering local competition. It's acting almost entirely as a tax collector.
A tax collector for foreign tech.
Yes. The EU leverages multi-billion-dollar fines against these foreign companies for DMA and DSA violations.
Yeah.
And those fines flow into the general budget, essentially funding the bureaucratic apparatus itself.
Wow.
It's created a system where Europe generates revenue not by creating tech products, but by penalizing the tech products created elsewhere.
It's like setting up the world's most lucrative speed trap on a highway you didn't build, catching cars you don't know how to manufacture, and then using the ticket money to just hire more traffic cops.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. And this dynamic has actually escalated from just corporate grumbling to actual geopolitical friction.
Really? Like at a government level?
Yeah, the United States State Department has recently imposed visa restrictions on certain EU officials. They formally accuse them of regulatory coercion against American platforms.
Wait, diplomatic standoffs over tech regulation? That is wild. The US government is actively saying to Europe, you are targeting our companies unfairly.
Exactly. When regulation shifts from standard consumer protection to what the U.S. perceives as targeted economic hostility, essentially a covert trade war disguised as privacy law, it becomes a high-level diplomatic dispute.
Which brings me to this analogy I was playing around with while reading through the sources. Tell me if this tracks. It feels like Europe has spent decades and billions of euros building the world's most secure, high-tech, perfectly designed lion cage.
Okay, a lion cage.
The bars are made of titanium, the locks are digitally encrypted, the welfare standards for the animals are impeccably documented, but they don't actually own any lions.
The lion cage metaphor is highly accurate, particularly when we apply it to the financial technology sector. If you look at the European cryptocurrency regulations, the parallels are exact.
Right, let's talk about MiCA.
MiCA stands for the Markets in Crypto Assets Regulation. It is, without a doubt, the most comprehensive, rigid, and secure legal framework for digital assets anywhere on the planet.
The ultimate financial cage.
They built the ultimate cage. They anticipated every risk. They mandated incredible transparency and demanded massive capital reserves from any company wanting to operate there.
Okay, so they have the perfect cage. Where are the lions?
The lions have migrated. Currently, 85% of global crypto trading volumes, the major decentralized finance or DeFi protocols, and the massive stablecoin issuers, they are based almost entirely outside of Europe.
Let me guess. US, Asia.
United States, Singapore, the UAE, and the Bahamas.
Let's pause and define those for the listener, just to be super clear on what Europe is losing out on here. DeFi protocols and stablecoins, what are we actually talking about in physical terms?
Sure. So decentralized finance, or DeFi, is essentially an attempt to build an automated bank entirely out of code.
Out of code, no buildings.
Exactly. Instead of human loan officers and brick-and-mortar branches, you have smart contracts on a blockchain that automatically match lenders with borrowers. And stablecoins are the lifeblood of that system. They are digital tokens permanently pegged to a fiat currency, almost always the US dollar, so you can trade without the wild price swings of something like Bitcoin.
Got it. So this is the next iteration of the global financial system, and Europe built the rules for it, but the companies building it just left.
They had absolutely no choice. The compliance costs embedded in MiCA are actively driving them away. Imagine you are a 24-year-old European software engineer, right? You and a couple of friends write a brilliant piece of code for a new DeFi lending protocol. You have maybe 50,000 euros in seed money. Under MiCA, to legally launch that code in Europe, you might need to spend 2 million euros on compliance lawyers, regulatory audits, and maintaining mandated capital reserves.
Before you even launch.
Before you even get your first user.
You're dead on arrival. The barrier to entry is just higher than the roof.
You simply cannot afford to exist. So what do? You don't abandon the code. You buy a plane ticket to Dubai, or you incorporate in Miami, where the regulatory environment actually allows you to test your product and grow.
That makes total sense from a founder's perspective.
MiCA achieved its stated goal, which was total security and consumer protection. But it achieved it at the cost of the total sterilization of the European crypto market.
Okay, this is the part that genuinely baffles me. If this regulation is actively driving innovation away, if the founders are fleeing, if the capital is migrating to the Middle East or America, why does Europe keep writing these laws? Surely the politicians can see the venture capital numbers dropping, right? They aren't blind.
They do see it, which brings us to the structural root of the disease. The regulations we just talked about, they're merely a symptom. To understand the underlying pathology, we have to dive into the Draghi report.
Right. Mario Draghi, the former president of the European Central Bank, the guy who famously said he would do whatever it takes to save the euro during the sovereign debt crisis.
The very same. He is a highly respected, deeply pragmatic economist. The European Commission tasked him with writing a comprehensive diagnostic report on European competitiveness. And what he delivered is a 400-page, brutally honest autopsy of the continent's economic health.
And his diagnosis is incredibly grim. He talks a lot about this concept. He calls it the middle tech trap. Walk me through what that actually means on the ground.
The middle tech trap is Draghi's way of explaining that Europe completely missed the digital revolution. While the US and Asia were busy building the internet, software platforms, cloud computing, and now AI, Europe remained firmly anchored in mature mid-20th century industrial sectors.
We're talking about things like traditional car manufacturing, heavy machinery, chemical plants, Europe was arguably the best in the world at in, say, 1995.
Exactly. But the global economy didn't freeze in 1995. The data Draghi presents is just staggering. Since 1995, the GDP gap, the difference in total economic output between the United States and the European Union, has literally doubled.
Doubled.
Yes, the U.S. integrated digital technology into every facet of its economy, massively boosting worker productivity. Europe, meanwhile, continued refining the internal combustion engine and, crucially, drafting regulations.
But let me push back on who is actually suffering from these regulations, because when I see the EU hit Meta with a $1 billion fine for violating the GDPR data privacy laws, part of me thinks, well, it's Mark Zuckerberg, he can afford it.
Right.
Are these massive tech laws actually hurting the American giants they're supposedly targeting?
That is one of Draghi's most critical insights, and it highlights a massive unintended consequence. Big tech companies have infinite resources. They have compliance departments that are larger than the entire workforce of most medium-sized businesses.
Yeah, armies of lawyers.
They can afford to hire former regulators, adapt their software, pay the fines, and just absorb the friction as a cost of doing business.
They just treat it like an operating expense.
Precisely. The real victims, the entities that are actually being crushed to death, are the European small and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs and the startups. Draghi notes that they die in what he calls the waiting regime of EU bureaucracy.
The waiting regime. What does that look like for a startup?
Let's create a hypothetical scenario. Say you start a health tech company in Paris. You build an app that uses AI to analyze x-rays and detect early signs of pneumonia. It's a great idea. You secure a few million in venture capital. But before you can sell it to a single hospital, you enter the waiting regime.
Here come the clipboards.
First, you have to prove your AI model complies with the AI Act's risk management frameworks. That takes 6 months and expensive consultants. Then, because you are dealing with patient x-rays, you have to ensure absolute bulletproof compliance with the GDPR.
Which means hiring specialized data privacy lawyers.
Right. And then you likely fall under the medical device regulation, which is notoriously slow, adding another year of clinical validation paperwork.
So I've spent 2 years and probably half my funding, and I haven't even launched the app yet. I haven't helped a single patient.
You run out of capital before you ever reach the market. Meanwhile, an American startup with the exact same idea launches in Texas, gets immediate feedback from real doctors, iterates the software, secures a massive Series B funding round, and prepares to expand globally.
So by trying to rein in the American monopolies, Europe accidentally built a regulatory moat that protects those exact monopolies from any homegrown European challengers. I mean, that is a staggering own goal.
It is a tragedy of unintended consequences. But Draghi points out that it's not just the new tech laws that are the problem, it's the fundamental physical structure of the European market itself. We constantly hear politicians praise the European single market, but Draghi's data shows it is a myth.
A myth.
It is incredibly fragmented.
Okay, let's contrast this, because the US is a massive market too. If I'm a founder in Austin, Texas, and I want to scale my business to sell to people in Denver, Colorado, and maybe open an office in New York, how much friction is there?
Very little. You are operating within one overarching federal system. You speak one language, you deal with one primary currency, one federal tax code, and a generally harmonized set of labor and corporate laws.
Right.
You can hire a developer in Denver, send them a W-2 tax form, and they start working on Monday. The friction to scale across 330 million consumers is incredibly low. Furthermore, if you need capital, the U.S. venture capital ecosystem is geared entirely toward high-risk, high-reward bets.
Yeah, a founder in Silicon Valley with a wild, ambitious idea can secure $100 million in a week if the VC firm believes the upside is big enough.
Right. They know 9 out of 10 startups will fail, but the 10th one becomes Uber, and that pays for the rest. So how does that exact same scenario play out in Europe?
Yeah, tell me.
First, the capital isn't there in the same way. The European banking and finance sector is historically and culturally much more risk-averse. A traditional European bank might look at a brilliant software startup and demand physical real estate collateral just to approve a €50,000 loan.
We love your app idea, but do you own a house we can repossess?
Exactly. The risk appetite is fundamentally mismatched with digital innovation. But let's say you do get the funding. Now you want to scale. You're a founder in Paris and you want to hire a sales team in Berlin and open a small office in Rome.
Should be easy. It's the single market.
In reality, you have just crossed into a bureaucratic nightmare. To expand, that single startup must navigate the distinct national tax codes of France, Germany, and Italy. You must comply with 3 entirely different sets of complex labor laws. Hiring and firing in France is vastly different from Germany.
Oh, man.
You are operating across 3 different official languages, which means translating every legal contract, every terms of service agreement, every HR policy. Across the whole EU, you are looking at 27 different legal jurisdictions and 24 languages.
That's insane.
The administrative friction of scaling a business is exponentially higher, which drains the capital and time you should be spending on product development.
So what is Draghi's solution? Because he didn't just write a 400-page complaint, did he? The sources say he offered very specific, very radical prescriptions to fix this.
He did, and they are radical because they require a surrender of national sovereignty. His first major proposal is something called the 28th regime.
The 28th regime, that sounds like a dystopian sci-fi movie. What actually is it?
It is a concept heavily backed by a movement called EUINC, which is a coalition of frustrated European tech founders. Draghi proposes creating a unified, digital, pan-European legal status specifically for startups.
So instead of being a French company or a German company...
Instead of incorporating under French law or German law, which make up the 27 existing national regimes, you incorporate under this new 28th regime. It acts as an overarching federal blanket.
Oh, I see.
It would allow a company to operate, hire, and pay taxes seamlessly across all 27 member states using a single set of standardized digital rules.
So I just bypass the local Parisian red tape or the Berlin labor laws entirely.
That is the goal. Draghi estimates that harmonizing this process would instantly save European startups 30% to 40% in legal and administrative compliance costs.
That is massive. But honestly, it's also a little dark. The fact that the most revolutionary, radical, save the economy idea Draghi can come up with is essentially, let's allow companies to use the same paperwork across borders.
Yeah.
I mean, that should have been done 30 years ago. What else is he proposing?
He takes direct aim at how innovation is funded. He proposes a total transformation of the European Innovation Council, the EIC. He wants to strip away the bureaucratic committees and model it directly after DARPA in the United States.
DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. For listeners who don't know, these are the guys in the Pentagon who essentially funded the creation of the internet, GPS, stealth technology.
Yes, DARPA is legendary for its methodology. They identify critical technological gaps, they find the smartest people working on them, and they fund high-risk, high-reward projects incredibly quickly based purely on technical merit.
Right.
They do not drown innovators in years of committee meetings, impact assessments, and endless application forms. Draghi wants Europe to build its own DARPA to inject agility into the system.
That makes total sense. Stop managing the risks, start taking some. Does he say anything about the regulations themselves? Like the AI Act we talked about?
Yes, and this is where he risks serious political blowback. He calls for suspending the AI Act sanctions for SMEs entirely.
Wait, just give him a free pass. Ignore the law.
He frames it as a regulatory sandbox. His argument is purely pragmatic. You have to let small companies test, train, and deploy AI models in the real world without the paralyzing fear of being bankrupted by a percentage of revenue fine for an honest mistake.
Yeah.
You have to allow the ecosystem to innovate first, and then you apply the regulations once they actually have a viable, mature product. You cannot regulate an industry that doesn't exist yet.
Okay, all of this sounds incredibly logical. Reduce the friction with a 28th regime, fund moonshots like DARPA, give startups breathing room from the fines. It's a solid playbook. What is the catch? How much does this all cost?
This is where Draghi's diagnosis hits the political brick wall. He estimates that to modernize its digital infrastructure, including proposing a massive EU Cloud and AI Development Act, to stop relying on Amazon and Microsoft, and to generally close the productivity gap with the US, the European Union needs 800 billion euros a year in extra investments.
800 billion euros every single year.
Every year.
That is a staggering amount of money. Where on earth does he expect that to come from?
That is the 800 billion euro question. Draghi knows that private capital markets in Europe aren't deep enough to supply that. So he suggests the only viable mechanism is issuing joint European debt. This is commonly known as Eurobonds.
Let's break down the mechanics of a Eurobond. How does that differ from just normal government borrowing?
Normally, Germany issues German bonds. And because their economy is historically strong, investors demand a very low interest rate. Italy issues Italian bonds. And because they have massive national debt, investors demand a higher interest rate to compensate for the risk.
Makes sense.
A Eurobond means all 27 nations borrow the money together as a single entity, backed by the collective economic weight of the entire union.
So they pool the risk.
Exactly. And this is where the political reality shatters Draghi's plan. The Northern European countries, particularly Germany and the Netherlands, are ideologically and fiscally terrified of mutualized debt. They adhere to strict fiscal discipline. They look at Southern European countries like Italy or Greece, who have historically run higher deficits, and they refuse to co-sign the loan. The Dutch taxpayer does not want to be on the hook if the Italian government defaults on its share of the $800 billion.
So because of this fundamental lack of trust between the North and the South, the Eurobonds are a non-starter.
They are politically toxic in Berlin and The Hague. They consistently block any attempt to issue them on a massive scale.
Let me get this straight. Mario Draghi, the man who literally saved the euro currency a decade ago, writes the definitive, data-backed guide on how to save the European economy from irrelevance. He tells them exactly what mechanisms to change. But because the member countries don't trust each other enough to share the bill, the proposals are just locked in a drawer.
That is the current tragedy of European governance. The diagnosis is universally accepted as accurate, but the prescribed treatment is considered politically unpalatable by key member states. So the patient continues to decline.
That is incredibly frustrating to hear, but it actually highlights a deeper thematic issue. Draghi told them to modernize and shift out of those mature 1995 sectors. But ironically, the one area where Europe is aggressively forcing modernization, the green energy transition, is actually destroying the only successful legacy industries they have left.
Yes.
Let's look at what is happening to the automotive sector.
The intersection of European industrial policy and environmental dogma. This is perhaps the most visible, tangible area where bureaucratic regulation has collided violently with physical supply chains and economic reality.
Let's talk about the 2035 combustion engine ban, because this seems like a massive gamble.
It is arguably the largest industrial gamble in modern European history. The European Union passed a rigid, top-down legal mandate to effectively ban the sale of all new internal combustion engine vehicles by the year 2035.
Total ban.
This law forces the entirety of the massive European automotive industry to abandon a century of engineering and shift entirely to battery electric vehicles, or BEVs.
Now, let me try to see it from the regulator's perspective. If you want to stop climate change, don't you need a hard deadline? If you just ask the car companies nicely to reduce emissions, won't they just drag their feet and keep selling profitable gas cars forever? Doesn't the deadline force the innovation?
That is the philosophical justification for the mandate. And historically, setting goals does drive market behavior. However, the structural flaw, the reason industrial analysts are sounding the alarm, is a profound failure of sequencing.
Sequencing, like the order of operations.
Exactly. The EU imposed an absolute, legally binding deadline on the manufacturers before securing the physical reality required to meet that deadline.
Oh, I see where this is going.
They mandated millions of battery-powered cars without having an internal supply chain to build the batteries. They lacked the critical raw materials. Furthermore, they passed the law without upgrading the continent's electrical grid infrastructure to handle the massive surge in demand required to charge tens of millions of new vehicles simultaneously.
So they ordered the roof of the house to be built before they
pour the foundation. Exactly. And beyond the supply chain, they committed a cardinal sin of industrial policy. They abandoned technological neutrality.
Explain that. What does it mean to be technologically neutral?
Technological neutrality means the government sets a performance standard. Say, all new cars must produce zero tailpipe emissions by 2035. But you leave it up to the engineers and the free market to figure out the best mechanism to achieve that goal.
We don't care how you do it, just get to zero.
Right. But the EU didn't do that. They picked a single technological winner, the battery electric vehicle. By doing so, they actively shut the door on alternative, potentially viable technologies like advanced biofuels, synthetic e-fuels, or hydrogen combustion engines.
Wow.
They forced legacy automakers like BMW, Volkswagen, and Fiat to completely abandon the internal combustion technology, where they held a massive global competitive advantage.
And they forced them to pivot to a technology, batteries, where they have absolutely no competitive advantage. Who does own the advantage there?
China. Which leads us to a massive strategic geopolitical pivot that Europe has trapped itself in. To build these mandated electric vehicles, as well as the solar panels and wind turbines required for the wider green transition, Europe must acquire critical minerals.
Lithium, cobalt, all that.
We are talking about lithium, cobalt, and especially rare earth elements. Currently, Europe relies on China for up to 90% of the processing of these rare earths.
Wait, so after the disaster of relying on Russia for natural gas, we essentially stopped funding Moscow for our energy, only to put our entire industrial future and our green transition squarely in the hands of Beijing.
That is the reality of the geopolitical trade-off. The EU successfully swapped a fossil fuel dependency on a hostile state for a clean tech dependency on a systemic rival.
That seems spectacularly short-sighted, but I remember reading that when the Chinese car companies actually started arriving in Europe, Brussels tried to fight back. Didn't they put tariffs on companies like BYD?
They did. Chinese brands like BYD and MG, which are heavily subsidized by the Chinese government at every stage of their supply chain, began flooding the European market with high-quality, incredibly cheap electric vehicles. They rapidly captured over 15% of European EV sales.
Which is huge.
In a panic to protect local manufacturers, Brussels slapped significant import tariffs on these Chinese vehicles.
Okay, let's trace the mechanics of a tariff here. If the EU slaps a 30% tax on a BYD car coming off a boat in Rotterdam, does that fix the problem for the German car makers? Did it work?
No, it has largely failed, because tariffs do not fix underlying structural uncompetitiveness. There are two reasons it failed. First, the Chinese producers have manufacturing margins so large due to cheaper labor and energy that they can often simply absorb the 30% tariff cost, reduce their profit margin slightly, and still undercut the price of a locally made Volkswagen.
They just eat the cost because they're already so far ahead.
Yes. Second, and more importantly, they're simply bypassing the tariffs entirely by physically altering their strategy. A tariff only applies to goods imported from outside the border.
Yeah.
So what does BYD do? They build massive manufacturing plants inside the European Union.
The Trojan horse strategy?
Precisely. BYD is currently building a massive, state-of-the-art manufacturing facility in Hungary. Once those cars roll off an assembly line in Hungary, they are legally considered European products. There are no tariffs within the single market.
So BYD gets to sell tariff-free cars inside Europe. But let's look at the ripple effect of this. What happens to the traditional European auto supply chain? I imagine a car isn't just made by Volkswagen. It's made by thousands of smaller companies.
That is the hidden devastation. The automotive supply chain in Europe, massively concentrated in Germany and northern Italy, is comprised of thousands of Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers. Small companies making specialized gears, fuel pumps, exhaust systems. A BYD plant in Hungary doesn't buy parts from those Italian suppliers. They bring their own highly integrated, battery-focused supply chains from China. So the European suppliers are getting crushed in the middle. They are losing their contracts with Volkswagen because VW is losing market share and they can't sell to the new Chinese plants.
You are watching the systematic dismantling of a century-old industrial base. But the sources point out it isn't just the car industry suffering from the green transition. There is this broader issue affecting every corporate entity, something called the CSRD.
The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. This is a prime example of what analysts call hyper-regulation and greenwashing. It is a massive framework requiring almost all significant companies in Europe to rigorously document, measure, and audit every conceivable environmental and social impact their business has.
Okay, on paper, if I'm an environmentalist, that sounds great. If a chemical company is dumping waste into a river, I want transparency. I want them to report it.
The intent is transparency. The physical reality of how it is executed is a massive misallocation of capital. Because the reporting requirements are so complex, ambiguous, and legally perilous, companies are spending billions of euros. But they aren't spending that money on actual physical research and development.
Right.
They aren't spending it on installing new, highly efficient energy filters on their smokestacks.
What are they spending it on?
They are spending it on armies of corporate auditors, compliance lawyers, and specialized consultants like KPMG or Deloitte just to certify their paperwork to Brussels. The sources describe it as a paper factory.
A paper factory.
Instead of buying a new low-emission furnace, a factory manager is forced to spend that budget hiring a consultant to write a 500-page ESG report about their old, dirty furnace.
It's the illusion of progress. You create a massive industry of compliance that doesn't actually lower a single degree of temperature on the planet. Which leads me to this concept of the delocalization of emissions, because when I figured out the math on this while reading the notes, it felt like the biggest blind spot of the entire European project. Walk me through how this actually works.
We have to zoom out and look at the global thermodynamic picture. Currently, the entire European Union accounts for roughly 7% to 8% of total global greenhouse gas emissions.
Wait, just 7 or 8%. So even if Europe went back to the Stone Age tomorrow and emitted zero carbon, 92% of the global emissions would still be happening.
Correct. The overwhelming majority of growth in emissions is coming from Asia, specifically China and India, as they rapidly industrialize. So Europe imposes incredibly strict, highly expensive regulations, like the CSRD or carbon taxes, on its domestic heavy industries in a noble attempt to reduce that 8%.
But heavy industry operates on tiny margins.
Yes. So by making industrial production legally burdensome and astronomically expensive at home, those industries don't simply cease to exist. Global demand for steel, fertilizer, and cement doesn't vanish. The industries just relocate.
They pack up their factories and leave?
They physically move their operations to jurisdictions with far less stringent environmental laws, cheaper labor, and cheaper energy. They move to India, or Vietnam, or parts of North Africa.
Hold on, let me trace the actual physical reality of this. Let's say I own a steel plant in Dusseldorf, Germany. The EU carbon taxes and the CSRD paperwork make it unprofitable to operate. I shut down the German plant and build a new one in India.
Okay.
In Germany, I was probably using highly regulated natural gas and modern scrubbers. In India, to keep costs down, I power the plant with a coal-fired grid, which is significantly dirtier. I produce the exact same amount of steel, I put more CO2 into the atmosphere because I'm burning coal, and then I put that steel on a massive diesel-burning cargo ship and sail it all the way back to Europe to sell it.
You have just perfectly described the exact mechanism of emission delocalization.
So the net result for the planet is that global pollution actually goes up. The emissions are simply exported outside the EU's borders so they don't show up on Brussels' official ledger. And simultaneously, we fire thousands of European steelworkers.
It achieves a localized statistical victory at the cost of a global environmental defeat and domestic impoverishment.
It is a staggering level of bureaucratic short-sightedness. You get to feel morally superior on paper while the planet gets hotter and your citizens get poorer. But as we transition here, companies aren't just fleeing because of the paperwork or the green mandates. Paper doesn't run a factory, energy runs a factory.
Yes, it does.
And the fundamental physics of European industry are currently broken because the energy simply costs too much. This brings us to the energy trap.
This is arguably the most acute existential crisis facing the continent's competitiveness today.
So, we've all heard the triumphant narrative for the last couple of years. After the invasion of Ukraine, Europe successfully freed itself from its addiction to cheap Russian pipeline gas. It was hailed across the media as a massive strategic and moral victory. But the economic sources we are looking at paint a very different, much darker reality about what that independence actually means.
The narrative of energy independence is, economically and physically speaking, a false independence. Europe did not discover massive new domestic energy reserves. It simply changed masters.
Right.
It swapped cheap, geographically convenient Russian pipeline gas for liquefied natural gas, or LNG, primarily imported from the United States and Qatar.
Let me stop you there, because to a layperson, gas is gas. Whether it comes from a pipe in Siberia or a ship from Texas, if it burns and runs the factory, why does it matter? Why is this a trap?
It matters because of thermodynamics and logistics. They impose an immense permanent fixed cost that can never be legislated away. Let's trace the physical journey of the energy. Previously, Russian gas flowed continuously through a massive steel pipe like Nord Stream directly into German chemical plants. The cost of transit was negligible.
It just flows. Very cheap.
Now, consider the journey of American LNG. First, you have to extract the natural gas via hydraulic fracturing in a shale field in Texas or Pennsylvania. Then, you pipe it hundreds of miles to a massive coastal facility. Here is where the physics become expensive. You must expend massive amounts of energy to compress that gas and freeze it to minus 162 degrees Celsius, at which point it becomes a liquid.
Minus 162 degrees. Just the sheer amount of electricity required to run those industrial freezers must be staggering.
It consumes a significant portion of the energy value of the gas itself, just to liquefy it. Then you load this cryogenic liquid onto highly specialized, incredibly expensive cargo ships. These ships must sail across the Atlantic Ocean, burning fuel the entire way.
And once it arrives in Rotterdam or Hamburg, you can't just pour minus 162-degree liquid into the city pipe.
No, you have to pump it into a regasification terminal. You must apply heat to turn the liquid back into a gas, and only then can you inject it into the European pipeline grid.
Okay, when you lay out the physical steps, it is glaringly obvious.
Every single step in that chain. The fracking, the pipeline to the coast, the cryogenic freezing, the transatlantic shipping, the regasification adds a permanent logistical and thermodynamic premium. It ensures, as a matter of physical law, that European energy will structurally always be significantly more expensive than American energy as long as they rely on U.S. exports. The U.S. factory gets the gas straight from the well, the German factory pays for the freezing and the boat ride.
That makes total sense. But relying on ships instead of a fixed pipeline opens you up to a whole new set of vulnerabilities, doesn't it? A pipeline is mostly underground and safe. A ship has to navigate the world. And our sources highlight a massive crisis hitting the market right now in 2026, the blockade of Hormuz.
This is the exact geopolitical blackout scenario that energy analysts have feared since Europe pivoted to LNG. The Strait of Hormuz, located between Oman and Iran, is one of the most critical maritime choke points in the world. And currently, due to escalating regional conflict and military operations, it is effectively blocked.
Blocked meaning the navies are physically preventing ships from moving.
It's worse than a physical blockade. It's an economic blockade via risk. Even if a massive LNG carrier could physically attempt to run the strait, the maritime insurance premiums for cargo ships transiting that area have either vanished entirely or become so astronomically high that it is economically unviable to make the trip. No company will risk a $200 million ship and its highly explosive cargo without insurance.
So the ships just drop anchor and stop moving.
They stop moving. Furthermore, the LNG infrastructure in Qatar, which is a massive exporter and the country Europe heavily bet on to replace the lost Russian gas, has sustained damage in the wider regional conflict.
So the gas from Qatar is physically trapped, and even if it wasn't, the ships won't sail. What is the domino effect of this for Europe?
It creates an immediate, desperate bidding war on the global spot market. Europe suddenly finds itself frantically competing with massive Asian buyers, energy-hungry nations like Japan, South Korea, and China for whatever uncontracted LNG is left on the market from the US or Africa.
It's a high-stakes game of musical chairs, but the prize is the baseline energy needed to keep your country from freezing and your factories from shutting down. What does this bidding war do to the price?
The data is devastating to European competitiveness. Natural gas in Europe is currently trading at 5 times the price of gas in the United States. Concurrently, the global disruption and fear have caused Brent crude oil to smash past the $100 a barrel mark, recently peaking at 126.
5 times the price. I'm trying to imagine running a business like that. If I own a glass manufacturing plant in Italy and my energy bill is 500% higher than a competing glass plant in Ohio, how do I stay open?
You don't. You'd shutter the factory, fire the workers, and import the glass from Ohio or China. And the situation regarding the winter is even more precarious. European Union regulations legally mandate that member states must have their strategic gas storages 90% full by November to ensure citizens can heat their homes through the winter.
90% is a safe buffer. Where are they at now?
Currently, because of the Hormuz crisis disrupting shipments and the exorbitant costs making governments hesitant to buy at peak prices, storages across the continent are sitting dangerously low at around 30%. They are not just facing an economic crisis. They are facing a physical shortage of molecules.
Wait, I need to ask you about a glaring contradiction here. If energy is in such incredibly short supply and the price of gas is astronomical, why do I keep scrolling past headlines about negative energy prices in Europe? You see these articles saying on Tuesday, electricity prices in Germany dropped below zero. It sounds like a renewable energy miracle, but it completely contradicts the crisis we are talking about.
It seems like a total paradox. But it all makes perfect, brutal sense when you understand the physical mechanics of the electrical grid. Europe has spent decades and trillions of euros installing massive amounts of solar panels and wind turbines across the continent.
Which is great for lowering carbon.
Yes, but wind and solar are what we call intermittent or non-dispatchable energy sources. You cannot control when they produce power. On a very sunny, very windy day in the spring or summer, millions of these panels and turbines produce massive, simultaneous surges of electricity.
Okay, so a huge, uncontrollable flood of electricity hits the grid all at once.
Yes, but the critical missing piece of infrastructure in Europe is industrial-scale battery storage. They simply lack the physical capacity to capture and store that massive surge for later use. Because the supply of electricity in that specific hour vastly outstrips the demand from homes and factories, the wholesale price of electricity on the market drops to zero or even goes negative.
So they are literally paying the market to take the power. That sounds great for the consumer, no?
You would think so, but here is the catch, and this is why the consumer's bill at the end of the month is still incredibly high. The electrical grid is not a bucket. It is a highly sensitive instrument that operates on a razor's edge of balance. The supply of electricity must precisely match the demand every single second of the day. If it doesn't, the frequency drops, transformers blow, and the entire grid collapses into a blackout.
So when that massive, uncontrolled surge of solar power hits, the grid operators panic.
They have to intervene heavily and instantly to keep the grid from overloading. They have to pay massive amounts of money for what are called dispatch costs, or system balancing charges.
Dispatch costs. Give me an analogy for how that works.
It's like needing a taxi, but you don't know exactly when you'll need it, and when you do, it has to be there in 3 seconds. So you pay a taxi driver to sit idling in your driveway 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with the meter running. You're paying heavily for the standby availability, not just the actual trip.
So in grid terms, the taxi is a natural gas plant.
Exactly. When the sun is shining, the grid operator tells a traditional backup plant, usually gas or nuclear, to rapidly power down to make room for the solar. Or, conversely, they pay the gas plant to stay on hot standby, burning fuel but not selling electricity, so that the literal second a cloud rolls over the solar farm, the gas plant can instantly ramp up and prevent a blackout. You cannot flip a massive thermal power plant on like a light switch. It takes hours to warm up, which costs millions.
So let me get this straight. Even when the solar power is technically generating free or negative electricity, the system is actively paying a gas plant to sit there burning expensive fuel just in case the weather changes.
Yes. These immense system balancing charges, the dispatch costs, are passed directly onto the consumer's final bill. This is why in countries with the highest penetration of intermittent renewables, like Denmark or the Netherlands, these system charges now make up 30% to 50% of the final retail energy bill. The wholesale electricity might be mathematically cheap for 1 hour at noon, but maintaining the massive, redundant physical infrastructure required to handle that volatility is incredibly expensive.
That completely shatters the illusion of those negative price headlines. It's not a miracle of cheap, abundant energy. It is a symptom of a deeply fragile grid that is struggling to violently balance itself. And as if the 5x gas prices from the Middle East and the massive grid balancing fees weren't enough, European factories also have to deal with the ETS.
The emissions trading system, yes. This is Europe's flagship carbon tax mechanism. It operates as a cap-and-trade system. On top of the base cost of their highly expensive energy, a European factory, say, a cement manufacturer or a steel mill, must purchase permits for every single ton of carbon dioxide they emit into the atmosphere. Currently, this carbon tax is hovering around 75 to 80 euros per ton.
So let me paint the full horrifying picture for a manufacturer trying to survive in Europe right now. Your base natural gas is 5 times more expensive than if you just moved your factory to Texas. Your electricity bill is artificially loaded with 50% grid balancing fees because of the intermittent solar panels on the grid. And on top of all of that, a regulator knocks on your door and hands you an 80 euro tax bill for every ton of carbon you emit while trying to keep the lights on.
That is the suffocating macroeconomic reality for heavy industry in Europe.
Does this punitive system exist in the US or China? Are there competitors facing this?
With this level of severity, absolute cost, and regulatory complexity? Absolutely not. China subsidizes its industries massively and continues to build coal plants to ensure cheap baseload power. The United States does not have a federal carbon tax like the ETS. In fact, the U.S. took the exact opposite philosophical approach with the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA.
The IRA,
Yeah.
the carrot versus the stick approach.
Precisely. While Europe uses the stick taxing and fining industries to force them to change, the U.S. uses a massive carrot. The IRA offers hundreds of billions of dollars in direct subsidies, tax breaks, and cheap energy guarantees to companies that choose to manufacture domestically in America without punishing them with a carbon tax while they transition.
And what is the result of Europe exclusively using the stick?
The result is not decarbonization, it is rapid, uncontrolled deindustrialization. Lured by the massive IRA subsidies in the US or the incredibly cheap, unregulated energy in the Persian Gulf or Asia, multinational corporations are simply throwing their hands up, shutting down their European sites, and fleeing the continent.
It's a total industrial exodus.
Yeah.
And to really see the combination of all these compounding factors, the paralyzing bureaucracy, the absurd energy prices, the rigid green mandates, and the geopolitical vulnerability, we just have to look at the historical economic engine of the continent itself. We need to look at what is happening to the fall of the German locomotive.
Germany is the perfect and perhaps most tragic case study for this entire deep dive. It encapsulates every policy failure we've discussed. For decades, the German economy was the undisputed, invincible powerhouse of Europe. It was the financial bedrock of the entire Union.
And what was their secret? How did they become so globally dominant?
They operated on a highly effective, highly optimized mercantilist model.
Define mercantilism in this modern context for me.
In this context, it was an export-driven economic strategy resting on three unshakable pillars. First, secure massive quantities of incredibly cheap, reliable Russian pipeline gas. Second, feed that cheap baseload energy into a world-class, highly skilled heavy industrial base. We're talking about chemical giants like BASF, automotive titans like BMW, Mercedes, and Volkswagen. Third, export those high-value, precision-engineered goods to the global market, particularly capturing the massive rising middle class in China.
Cheap energy in, high-value cars, and chemicals out. It's an incredibly lucrative business model, until it isn't.
Until all three of those foundational pillars are systematically kicked out from under you in the span of a few years. Germany is currently facing a perfect storm of external shocks and self-inflicted policy wounds. We already discussed the catastrophic loss of cheap Russian gas, which absolutely devastated their energy-intensive chemical industry. But they compounded this external crisis with a baffling domestic policy choice. They deliberately shut down their perfectly functioning zero-carbon nuclear power plants right in the middle of a global energy crisis.
This is the part that makes my head spin. I'm trying to deduce the logic here. If you know you are losing your cheap Russian gas, and you know industry needs reliable power when the wind isn't blowing, why on earth would you permanently turn off your nuclear plants?
Because it wasn't an economic or industrial decision. It was a deeply entrenched political commitment. It was heavily driven by the Green Party and their governing coalition, fulfilling a decades-old anti-nuclear pledge made long before the current energy crisis. They prioritized an ideological stance over the survival of their industrial energy security.
So they intentionally turned off their most reliable baseload power while gas prices were skyrocketing and the economy was teetering. That is wild. And what is the tangible result for their legendary heavy industry?
We are witnessing an industrial retreat that was utterly unthinkable even a decade ago. For the first time in its 87-year history, Volkswagen is actively threatening to close domestic manufacturing plants in Germany.
Volkswagen closing plants in Germany. Let's ground this for the listener. That isn't just a corporate restructuring. That is like Ford abandoning Detroit, but on a national scale. It's a psychological earthquake for the country.
It is a profound macroeconomic and cultural shift, and the ripple effects of a massive auto plant closing are devastating.
Right. Think about the local economy. If VW closes a plant in a German town, it's not just the 5,000 assembly line workers who lose their jobs. It's the Tier 2 supplier making the seatbelts down the road. It's the local logistics company that transports the parts. It's the local bakery that sells lunch to the workers. It's the municipal government that suddenly loses massive corporate tax revenue and has to cut funding to the local schools. You are watching the rapid hollowing out of working-class communities in real time.
And this localized devastation places the broader European economy in a crushing macroeconomic vice. Let's look at the hard data for 2026. The Eurozone's total GDP growth is stuck at a miserable 1.1%.
1.1%. That's essentially statistical noise. It's barely moving.
Germany itself, the former locomotive, is hovering between perpetual stagnation and technical recession. Meanwhile, the United States economy, fueled by tech innovation and cheaper domestic energy, is growing at almost triple that rate. Furthermore, international bodies like the OECD and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development are aggressively slashing their global growth estimates for Europe because of the ongoing Hormuz shipping crisis and the sticky return of inflation.
The export data is terrifying too. I saw in the sources that Italian exports to the Middle East dropped by 33% in just 2 months because of the Red Sea and Hormuz shipping blockade. 1/3 of their trade in that region just evaporated overnight because the ships can't get through.
And that leads us to the other side of the macroeconomic vice, the return of global protectionism. Specifically, the impending reality of Donald Trump's aggressive tariff policies in the United States.
Right, so let's connect the dots. At the exact moment, European industry is getting crushed by 5x energy costs, and they are losing their access to Eastern markets because of maritime blockades. The U.S. slaps sweeping tariffs on European exports to protect their own domestic manufacturing. It's a devastating punch straight to the chest when Europe is already on its knees.
It completely breaks the final pillar of the German export model. If you cannot produce cheaply because your energy is too expensive and you cannot sell easily to the US or China because of tariffs and geopolitical tension, your economy shrinks. It is a mathematical certainty.
But wait, when an economy faces a crisis like this, when massive anchor companies are failing and people are losing jobs, shouldn't the government step in? In 2020, during COVID, European governments spent hundreds of billions of euros to subsidize wages and keep businesses afloat. Why can't Germany or Italy just subsidize Volkswagen and the steel mills right now?
Because of a self-imposed legal straitjacket known as the Stability Pact trap, during COVID, the EU temporarily suspended its strict fiscal rules. But now, they have reinstated the Stability and Growth Pact, which legally limits how much debt a member state can take on and mandates strict deficit reduction.
So austerity rules are back in effect.
Yes, so at the exact critical moment that highly industrialized countries with historically high debt like Italy or France desperately need to intervene, subsidize their dying industries, and help families cope with skyrocketing energy bills, Brussels points to the treaty and tells them they legally cannot spend the money.
Their hands are tied behind their backs by their own bureaucratic treaties. This has to be causing massive, explosive internal fights within the European Union.
It has fractured the Union along very clear, very bitter ideological and industrial fault lines. Impartially observing this political divide, we see heavily industrialized nations like Italy and the Czech Republic literally begging the European Commission to declare a state of economic emergency. They want to temporarily suspend the ETS carbon tax and delay the green mandates just to allow their factories to survive the Hormuz energy price spike.
They're essentially screaming, pause the utopian climate goals for a minute. The patient is bleeding out on the table.
That is their position. But on the other side of the fracture, you have nations that are less reliant on heavy manufacturing or are more politically committed to environmentalism, like Sweden and Spain. Their argument is the exact opposite.
How can they argue the opposite when the factories are closing?
They argue that the Hormuz crisis and the fossil fuel price spikes are absolute proof that fossil fuels are inherently unstable and a geopolitical liability. Therefore, they argue, Europe must not pause, but must rapidly accelerate the green transition at any social or industrial cost to finally achieve total energy independence via renewables.
Wow. So you have a sinking ship and half the room is screaming, stop the engines, we're taking on water, and the other half is screaming, no, push the throttle to maximum, we have to sail out of the storm faster. It is a paralyzing internal contradiction.
It is the ultimate test of the European project's cohesion. When brutal industrial reality collides with inflexible regulatory ambition, something eventually has to give. You cannot legislate the laws of thermodynamics or global market economics away.
So, what does this all mean? We have spent the last hour weaving through a massive amount of data and painting a picture that is, frankly, grim. But it is grounded entirely in the objective economic reports, the Draghi findings, and the fiscal realities of the market we've sourced. Let me try to synthesize what we've uncovered here. Europe, the very birthplace of modern industry, the continent that invented the printing press, the combustion engine, and the foundational theories of quantum physics, is essentially dying of legalism. By adopting this underlying philosophy that regulating the world is the exact same thing as governing it, the continent is transforming itself. But it's not transforming into a cutting-edge tech superpower, and it's not transforming into an economically viable green utopia. It is turning into a beautiful, hyper-regulated, open-air museum. It is pristine, the privacy rules are perfect, the environmental targets are theoretically clean on a spreadsheet, but industrially and technologically, it is becoming completely sterile. We are writing the definitive 400-page rulebooks for artificial intelligence technologies we don't invent. We are trying to run heavy factories on imported, liquefied energy we mathematically cannot afford. And we are tying our own hands with fiscal treaties while the rest of the world, the US, China, India, plays a completely different, much more aggressive game of industrial dominance.
It is a profound structural shift from a dynamic culture of creation and risk-taking to a stagnant culture of compliance and risk aversion. And that leaves us with a final, rather provocative concept for the listener to mull over, building on that share without land paradox we discussed at the beginning. In geopolitical and economic circles, there is a widely discussed concept known as the Brussels effect. It's the idea that because the European consumer market is so large and historically wealthy, global multinational companies will simply adopt strict European regulations worldwide just to maintain access to that single market. It is Europe's primary remaining export to the world, its regulatory framework.
Right. So the logic is if Apple wants to sell iPhones to millions of people in Paris and Berlin, They have to make the iPhone comply with EU charging port rules or privacy laws. And because it's too expensive to make two different types of iPhones, they just adopt the European rule globally. Europe rules the world through red tape.
That has been the operating theory for 2 decades. But here's the question for you to explore on your own, given everything we've discussed today regarding the shifting balance of global power. What happens when the rest of the world, particularly the booming, rapidly industrializing economies of Asia and the resurgent, heavily subsidized industrial base of the Americas, decides that those European rules are simply too expensive to follow? Does a de-industrializing, technologically lagging Europe still possess the economic gravity to force the globe to conform to its paperwork? Or does the global market eventually reach a tipping point where they simply bypass Europe entirely, deciding that accessing the open-air museum isn't worth the administrative hassle and leaving the continent to safely and perfectly regulate its own decline?
That is a chilling thought. A perfectly regulated, perfectly safe, completely empty room. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives you hear, keep looking deeply at the underlying data, and keep examining the unseen forces that are quietly but radically shaping our world. We'll see you next time.